point was so intense that you overwhelmed the internet, and we lost you for about a minute. So you were just about to explain what structures of consciousness are.
Okay. So I'm going to take just a few minutes and give some examples of structures of consciousness and why they're important as states of consciousness. And again, we have a pretty good start in states, but we haven't done really anything with structures. And so this is just something that I would like us to put on the table and to think about as we're pursuing our investigation of states of consciousness. We want to also start looking at how we can look at these structures of consciousness. Because what it turns out is that where states of consciousness are first person, direct, immediate experiences, that when you have a state of consciousness experience, you'll know it immediately. You're directly aware of it, it's in your consciousness, and you know what it is. You can experience it, you're aware of it. Structures of consciousness don't enter awareness. And so we're really not aware of them, even if we're being influenced by these structures. And so a state consciousness can be meditative states where we have experiences of peace, relaxation, calm. We can have experiences of thinking, dropping down, and we can enter non-conceptual states of awareness. We can have experiences of being bathed in universal bliss and love and care. And in all of those cases, when any one of those happens, we know we are fully aware of that. Structures of consciousness, on the other hand, are much more like rules of grammar that govern how we talk. Every person brought up in a particular language-speaking culture ends up speaking that language pretty accurately. They put subject and verb together correctly. They use adjectives and adverbs correctly. They, in other words, grow up using grammar quite correctly. But if you ask them to write down what these rules of grammar are, almost nobody can do it. First of all, because not many people really realize that they're following rules of grammar, even though they are. And they certainly don't realize what those rules are. So those are structures of consciousness that are actually determine our experience and how we interpret something, but we have no idea they're there. So we're not aware of these structures of consciousness, these hidden grammars, these hidden maps that we have that govern how we interpret reality. And one of the most important things is these structures of consciousness that govern how we interpret our reality also govern how we interpret our states of consciousness. So we're going out and we're studying these states of consciousness, we're studying enlightenment, we're studying awakening, and we're studying peace, we're studying relaxation. But each one of those is going to be interpreted and therefore experienced slightly differently by these structures of consciousness that the person has when they have the state experience. So we have structures interpreting states, and we're aware of states, but we're not aware of structures. And we can see this because human beings became aware of states of consciousness going back at least to some of the earliest shamans. Maybe 50,000 years ago, human beings discovered states of consciousness. Again, just the first person, conscious. When you experience it, you know it. Structures of consciousness weren't discovered until 100 years ago, because they're not that obvious. And because they were only discovered 100 years ago, and even though they determine how we interpret our reality, but being only 100 years old, none of them were included in any of the meditation systems or the spiritual systems worldwide. So you can find states of consciousness, and there is meditative maps of states of consciousness in all of the world's meditation systems and all the world's spiritual systems. But in not a single world meditation system can you find the states that structures go through. Or can you find any understanding of structures at all? They're just not included. And so that means meditation systems were showing us how to wake up, but they weren't showing us how to grow up. They weren't showing us how to go through higher levels of structures in the way they were showing us how to go through higher levels of states. And so from the great meditative traditions, we learned states, we learned maps of states, and we learned how to move from lower states to medium states to the highest states. And those highest states were called enlightenment, awakening, and so on. But for growing up, moving through the structures of consciousness, we learned nothing. Not from the spiritual traditions. And so today, as we're using technology to explore consciousness, we're exploring states of consciousness. We have nothing on structures of consciousness. So, what's the structure of consciousness? And there are, first of all, most Western maps of developmental psychology are dealing with structures of consciousness. They don't know anything about states. And so most of the Western developmental models don't have anything like enlightenment or awakening or being free from samsara and discovering nirvana or finding ultimate peace and so on. They have none of that. Just as the meditative states of waking up have nothing on growing up. So we have these two different types of growth. Never have both of them been brought together, literally, in history. Which means that human beings have been practicing just one or the other way of growing up. Which means we have never combined the two together. And so what we've been doing is practicing just half of how we can grow up. In other words, humans, throughout our entire history, have been training ourselves to be partial. We've been training ourselves to be broken. We've been training ourselves in either growing up or waking up, never both. And that's a disaster. So one of the great things that can start to happen as we technologically explore consciousness is that if we not only explore states of consciousness and waking up, but we also start to explore structures of consciousness and growing up. When that happens, we'll be putting together waking up and growing up in a way to produce literally, in all of history, the first full, whole human beings. It's never happened before. So, briefly, what are some of these structures of growing up? What do they look like? What do they tell us? Here I'll say there's at least 3 dozen different major schools of growing up. And these are Western developmental schools of developmental psychology. These people spend their entire time tracking the ways that human beings, in their relative finite condition, grow, develop, and evolve. And what they found, as they looked at all of the human beings' multiple intelligences, as they looked at cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, and so on, is that as different as each of these intelligences are, they all grow and develop. You start as an infant at the very lowest stages of any of those intelligences, and then as you grow and develop, you move through higher and higher structures of consciousness. And so, as they tracked that, they found that all the different multiple intelligences, sometimes called different lines of development, that these different lines of development all move through the same levels of development. And so growing up became, in particular, a study of the levels of consciousness or the levels of growing up that human beings have available to them. Now again, these are levels of growing, implicit rules and implicit grammars that at each stage of growing up, as you mature and get more and more grown up, these implicit, hidden stages of grammar become more and more inclusive, more and more enveloping, more and more embracing. And they literally go from, for example, at the earliest stages of growing up, tend to be what's called egocentric. You care about and identify with only yourself. The next stage, general stages, tend to be called ethnocentric. You expand your identity from yourself to a group. It could be your family, a clan, a tribe. It can even be members of your religion. If you are a fundamentalist Christian, then, and let's say an evangelical, then all evangelicals are your brothers or sisters. And so you're identified with all of them. But those who aren't evangelicals are infidels, and you don't identify with them. As a matter of fact, you don't like them, because your identity is still identified with just one group against all the other groups. And so these other groups are infidels. Infidels don't have a soul. It's not a sin to murder an infidel. As a matter of fact, it listed good on your religious CD. So if you go to heaven and God says, how many infidels did you kill? You go, well, 428. God would go, way to go, you're doing good. So that's ethnocentric, was better than egocentric, but still far from perfect. The next major general stages don't care about just one group, they care about all groups. So this is called world-centric. And here I identify with, or I try to treat fairly, all individuals, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. And most of us would recognize that as a very high level of moral development. What's striking is that if human beings were on this planet for 1 million years, we only got the idea that one human being owning another human being, in other words, slavery, we only got the idea that slavery was bad 300 years ago. It took us that long to realize that was bad. And so it was only in the 100-year period, starting from approximately 1780 to 1880, that slavery was outlawed for the first time in all of human history. Did those original meditative systems have anything against slavery? No. They thought it was the way it should be. were those original meditative systems, again created 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Did they include women fully in all parts of society? No. So even those original meditative systems of waking up, even with their enlightenment, that wasn't enough to cure them from racism or belief in slavery. It wasn't enough to cure them from sexism or belief in patriarchal dominance. So enlightenment isn't enough to take care of a lack of growing up. And these early meditative systems were all ethnocentric. So that's again why we have to put them together. Carol Gilligan, who became a very famous feminist for suggesting that men and women reason differently, that men tend to reason in hierarchical terms, and women tend to reason in relational or non-hierarchical terms. And that was true, she did make that point. But she made a second point that was seriously overlooked, and that is that both men and women, men thinking hierarchically and women thinking non-hierarchically, that both of them went through the same 4 stages of growing up or structured development. And for Carol Gilligan, the 4 stages of women's moral development went from selfish, where the woman cares only for herself. Again, we call this egocentric. Then she moves to what Gilligan called care, where a woman learns to care for at least a group of people. This is what we call ethnocentric. From there, the woman moves to what Gilligan called universal care, where a woman cares for all people, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. And this is what we call world-centered. And then she had the 4th highest stage, which she simply called integrated, and which we call integral. So those are 4 stages, and that's one of the simplest models of growing up we have. Most models have 6 to 8 levels of development. So Gene Gebser, for example, gave worldview levels of development as moving from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral. Now these are related. Archaic and magic are egocentric. Mythic is ethnocentric. Rational and pluralistic are world-centric. And integral is integrated. So you see that there are basic similarities in these maps of growing up. But the important thing is that you can be at almost any structure of growing up and have a state experience of almost any state of waking up. And this is what is so alarming. So you can be at an ethnocentric, racist, sexist level of growing up, and you can go through all of the major stages of waking up, all the way to ultimate unity consciousness. How do we know that this can happen? First of all, we have actual tests showing that. I mean, literal empirical tests with people at ethnocentric going all the way through all of the states of waking up to the very highest. We have Zen masters who are ethnocentric and go all the way and are fully transmitted as Zen masters. And yet they still have something low in their growing up. We just learned recently of Sasaki Roshi, over 100 years old, and for the last 60 years, spent his time sexually abusing women. Here's a man revered for the depth of his waking up experience, and yet his psychosexual stage of growing up was egocentric. The one doesn't cure the other. And you can be very high in one, very low in the other, or any combination of the two. And so if you just teach states of waking up, and we don't also teach structures of growing up, we're not helping. If we take ethnocentric or egocentric people and teach them states of awareness all the way to ultimate unity consciousness using technological feedback, that hasn't helped. That's given ethnocentric people a way to be even more convinced of the rightness of their ethnocentric presences. And again, all of the great spiritual systems were founded in ethnocentric eras, and many of them remain that way. So, what do we want to do? At the very least, with just one simple example, as we start to see how consciousness states and structures can be put into computers in a way to give us feedback. So we've seen how feedback can help us get into states of waking up. What would we do to help feedback move us through these structures of development? One very quick example, and then I'll pause on this so you can sort of let it in, or you can get questions or talk about any aspect of it that you like. But let's say you take a model of growing up like Kohlberg's moral stages of development. And Wilber came up with 6 or 7 major structures of moral growth. And these structures intended to just number. So structure 1 and 2 corresponds to Gebser's archaic and magic. His stages, and he called them pre-conventional, which we call egocentric. Then his second 2 stages corresponded to mythic, ethnocentric stages, and these he called conformist or conventional stages. And then his highest stages corresponded to rational and pluralistic, his stages 5 and 6, and these he called post-conventional. And then he postulated the 7th higher universal mystical oneness, and that corresponds with the integral stage of development. So take 3 groups of individuals, have them be similar in all variables, similar in age, similar in financial background, similar in education, similar in IQ, and so on. With one major difference, have 3 groups, and the first group is all at Kohlberg's lowest egocentric stages of moral development. The next group are all at Kohlberg's conventional stages of development. And in the final group, all of them are at Kohlberg's post-conventional stages of development. And then with that, give each of them a moral dilemma, and then turn on the brain-mind machines and start measuring everything you can about brain activity. And see if you can't find some difference in brain patterns between egocentric, ethnocentric, and world-centric structures of morality. Once you find that, then you'll have a key into getting the same kind of feedback from computers to help with structures that we now have feedback from computers helping with states. Because one thing is for sure, if we train just structures, then we might help people grow up in morality, but we will never have awakening and enlightenment an ultimate truth realization. We will only have stages of relative small self-realization. If we train people just in waking up, we might help them achieve unity consciousness, but the way they interpret that could be egocentric or ethnocentric or world-centric. People at unity states that are at egocentric and ethnocentric stages of development, they're not helping this world. They're hurting. That's the problem. Unless we combine both of these, we are going to produce a technological, profound aid that is going to help us continue to produce broken people, fractured, alienated, isolated people. On the other hand, learning to bring waking up and growing up together would give us, for the first time in history, something the great traditions had never, ever been able to do, a way to bring together these two fundamental growth processes that human beings have. This would be unheard of. This would be one of the fastest growing ways for humanity to achieve its highest potentials and to therefore drop its constant infighting, bickering, and battles, all of which come from being at a lower stage of growing up or waking up. What we find in studies repeated and shown is that as you get in the higher stages of each of these, growing up and waking up, you produce more and more human beings that don't want war, don't want fighting, have a great deal of tolerance, want to work together for the betterment of all humanity. In other words, the type of human beings that most of us would like to see populate the earth before we destroy the earth. Those of you now working on technology, those of you now programming technology, those of you now working on the algorithms that will give feedback to humans on how to grow their consciousness, it's in your hands to start produce whole humans. Humans that have access to ultimate reality and waking up and growing and producing the highest states possible, as well as humans that would be at the highest stages of growth and include all human beings in their circle of solidarity. Again, something like this has never happened. Something like this is up to you. So please give that some thought and let us see if we can work.
You didn't let us down, Ken. Thank you. That was awesome. So, really, really important. We've got, let's say, about 15 minutes.
Okay.
And in that time, what I'd love to do is, I think Dustin and I have a couple questions. We actually are joined. It's kind of cool. I forgot to mention it, but this is our first time doing a simultaneous meetup. So we have, Chris, how many other meetups? So we have 2 other meetups in other parts of the United States that are meeting right now, other consciousness hacking meetups that are live streaming Ken and kind of joining us as a community in other parts of the United States. So it's pretty cool. For those of you that don't know, that's of about 22 communities that we have around the world. So it's cool to be joined by these other people. And then I'd love to get at least one question from those other 2 communities, and then as many questions as we can from here. So it's ambitious and bold, and so we'll try to be succinct. I would love to ground something what Ken has been talking about. As he was speaking, I kind of realized, I'm starting to already see the emergence, the early stages of technologies that support not just the state transition, but the stage development. One example of this is virtual reality being used for empathy. And so, for example, virtual reality has been used between Palestinian and Israeli soldiers to actually help them step into each other's shoes and take a very strongly held ethnocentric perspective and actually begin to crack that and begin to allow people to see a larger holistic or global perspective. And so that's one small example of what's just beginning to emerge.
Yes, yes. And of course, people have understood that we do have, an ethnocentric attitude. I mean, ethnocentric as a notion doesn't just belong to these growing up models. So there's always been people that wanted to work on how do we get outside of an ethnocentric understanding. And all the growing up process does is it places ethnocentric in an unfolding sequence of capacities that once a person learns them in the egocentric stage, then they'll actually move into an ethnocentric stage. So a growing up process gives us the actual mechanisms that allow people to move from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to integrated or cosmocentric. And so that's the advantage they have. And so that's why we would like to, for example, work growing up into our educational systems. Hopefully, we'll also be working some waking up into our education systems. But yes, anything that helps people see ethnocentric views and realize what is an ethnocentric view. It's a view that I hold, that I think is right, that my group has, and yours doesn't. And as long as we have that, that, by the way, is the foundation of fundamentalism. And that's why every fundamentalist religion on the face of the planet, and by the way, 70% of religions are ethnocentric. That's not good. Every ethnocentric religion thinks they have the one and only true way to God. And as long as they hold that belief, we will never have anything resembling world peace or world solidarity. We will have nothing but the single greatest cause of war, torture, and murder in humankind's history, and that's ethnocentric religion. And that's why people like the new atheists are absolutely vicious on any sort of ethnocentric religious orientation. What they don't see is that the higher stages, world-centric and cosmocentric, actually do bring love and binding and care into the picture. And this is how religion has managed to be both. And I'm sure many of you thought, how can this be? Religion has managed to be both the main source of talking about love for all, care for all, one God who loves everybody, and yet has caused more wars, more suffering, more jihad, more holy war than any other single human activity. And the answer is development. In the lower stages, you have a very narrow, isolated identity. You care only about yourself or your group. That's as far as your morality goes. If you keep growing, because growth means greater consciousness, wider identity. When you start to identify with all humans, then all humans are your brothers and sisters, not just all your religious brothers and sisters. And so definitely working with ethnocentric like that is a great idea. What we would like to recommend is that we have a whole understanding now of where that ethnocentric comes from, where it fits in human growth and development, and therefore how we can work it in a way to get some really good results with helping people to move on.
Great, thank you, Ken. That's fascinating. So, Ken, one of the things I want to do is I want you to dream with us a little bit.
Yeah.
Dream about the future. So I just want to give you an example. I was in a conversation with a person who's part of this community a couple of weeks ago, and he said his grand master plan is to eventually develop a virtual reality world that could help people develop through higher stages of human potential. So he was calling it, he wanted to be able to incubate human beings so that potentially they could spend the first part of their life both in human contact but in this virtual world that could systematically bring people out of these more ethnocentric modes of development and potentially even give them some state training as well. And now I was reminded of an indigenous group called the Kogi who live in the Colombian Andes. And they have a particular practice where they take certain young people from their tribes and they bring them into darkness at a really early age. And after bringing them into darkness, they keep them there and they tell them all about the world for the first 7 to 8 years of their life. And then suddenly they bring them out of the cave and they have such a massive spiritual realization, awakening to seeing the real world as opposed to the world that they've described to them in darkness, that they hold a sacred function within their community and within their culture. And so I was just drawing this parallel, that if we can start creating worlds of immersion through virtual reality to help people both grow up and wake up, maybe we reintroduce this sort of sacred function for particular people in our society who can hold these human potentials for us in our culture. So that's just one example, Ken. But I want to hear from you. What do you think is coming for humanity? What do you dream about? Where could we go as a human species?
Right now, this of course is a very big topic. Right now, maybe for the first time in my life, I'm a little bit worried that it does seem to be something of a horse race. If you look at all the bad things that are facing us right now, and by the way, almost all of them are global, but we all know the wicked problems that we're facing. There are dozens of them, from global warming to world financial meltdown, to worldwide epidemics, to worldwide terrorism. This is the environmental issue in particular looking extremely problematic. So we have all of these truly almost society-ending problems. At the same time, and in almost equal amounts, we have what might be called singularities that are occurring in what I would call all four quadrants. We have singularities occurring in nanotech. By singularity, I just mean technological revolutions. We have them occurring in the upper right, for the individual organism. We have nanotechnology. We have genomics. We have robotics. These are racing forward in ways that are just staggering. And same thing in the lower right, where we look at worldwide systems and interactions. Here we're really starting to work on financial systems. We're starting to work on global warming. We're starting to work on artifacts and how those interact. And the technological age has a huge amount to play in that. In the upper left, we're starting to see these coming together of individual paths of growth and development that include waking up and growing up, and what you and I would call cleaning up and showing up. In other words, these are all radically new approaches. They're all coming together, and the result is explosive. And so for us to be able to achieve a world that has an integral level of moral development, with human beings that are enlightened or awakened stages, nothing like that, even vaguely, has ever existed. This is a real possibility. And in the lower left, culture, how we actually think about all of this, these ideas have a real possibility of spreading worldwide. When about 10% of the leading edge reaches a cultural impact, it seems to spread through the whole culture. About 5% of the world's population are at integral levels. Many developmentalists think that that can go to 10% within a decade or so. That would give us 4 revolutions in all quadrants, positive revolutions. Those are all facing the equivalent negative ones, any one of which could spell the end of humankind. I've never seen anything like it. So which one do I think is going to win? I have to say, of course, my heart is with the positives, but I think it's going to be close. And I think the real importance is how quickly these kinds of ideas reach a larger humanity. Because notice what we're saying here. We're saying we have major problems. Now, instead of saying that they are just problems out there in the environment, that we need more resources, we need to deal with global warming, we need more economic, equitable terms, and so on. That's all true. But what we're saying is, wait, there are internal human potentials that are extraordinary and that have the capacity to literally remake all of this. And technology has a role to play. So, what happens when we start growing up? What happens when we start waking up? What happens when we start cleaning up and showing up? And when Mike and Siegels are out there translating this into technological capacities, this would be amazing. But people have to learn that they have those realities available to them. Most people don't know that they can wake up. Most people don't know that you can grow up to higher and higher levels of bigger consciousness, more loving, more care. They just have no idea. So it's a matter of learning, getting the ideas out, while we move forward with technological breakthroughs. If we do that, I think we've got a chance.
Thank you so much, Ken. So we have a little bit of time left. I would love to get, we don't have time for a lot of questions, but I'd love to get at least one question from our audience, and then I would love to talk to our audience elsewhere.
Sure.
In the very back over here, maybe have that part. So come, maybe come up. Oh, there we go. We got a mic. Okay.
So the question is, when you say historically there has been growth in stages of consciousness or states of consciousness, but there has not been structural growth.
It's occurred over broad stretches and without an understanding that would allow individuals to take up their path on their own. It wasn't understood as a whole process.
Understood, but it feels like a good chunk of Buddhist tradition is designed to keep you from waking up and slow down the process, to keep you from becoming an enlightened asshole, so to speak.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
there was that tradition of slowing it down and actually helping you reach the moral growth. So it's not a recent phenomenon. It's actually, there have been people who are aware, who were aware of the two possibilities, two tracks.
Very, very rare, and they really didn't see how to put them together. And that's a real problem. Like I say, even the great, profound original meditative systems, Buddhism, Christian mysticism, Kabbalah, Vedanta, Taoism, these mostly arose during the mythic membership or egocentric stages of development. So even though they had enlightenment, oneness with everything, they weren't one with slaves. They weren't one with women. They had very limited, most of them were homophobic in some ways. So waking up isn't enough to force growing up to occur. And there's one other quick thing. Many of our states of consciousness can be gotten into fairly quickly. If you hook people up to brain mind machines, you can get them into delta states, which might be witnessing or even mirror mind states. You can do that fairly quickly, maybe 15, 20 minutes. You can use any number of brain-mind assisted technologies and get states appearing very quickly. Structures take time. Structures are like learning to be a concert pianist. You can't hook somebody up to a brain-mind machine and an hour later they're ready to appear at Carnegie Hall. So we have to say, states are free, structures are earned. Robert Keegan, a great developmentalist at Harvard, estimates that it takes an average of 5 years for an adult to grow one structured stage. Now, we believe with technology and with things like integral life practice that we can accelerate that, possibly to 3 years, possibly to 1 year. We don't want to rush that part too much, because the point about structures of consciousness is that's how you learn about the world at the level of development that you're at. So you don't want to rush quickly over concrete operational thinking, or over formal operational thinking, or over systems logic, systemic thinking. There are things to learn in each of those that's going to help you be a more full-fledged human being. So we want to keep that in mind. And it's one of the things that makes structured learning difficult. The problem is they are radically important because they determine how everything else is experienced. It's how we interpret and experience everything that comes to us, including all of our states of consciousness, all of our enlightenment states, all of our awakening states, and so on. So we really want to work on both of those.
Cool. Thanks, Ken.
Yes, sir.
So we have to do a quick restart of our system. So hold on, Ken. We're just going to quickly restart, and then when we restart, we're going to bring in our 2 other communities, and we're going to actually have a comment from Dustin on this recent topic.
I think just the question was asked. I think is the gentleman still here? Please. I just you're speaking on it. I just want to before you go. I think it's actually a really astute point that clearly we have traditions that somehow protect against there being enlightened assholes, of course. I think the difference being, I like to think of what Ken is talking about, almost like your iPhone. So if you look at your iPhone, stages of development or structures of development are like upgrading your operating system. Waking up is to recognize that you're the whole phone. But religious and spiritual traditions also have apps. And so I felt a little bit like the question that you were pointing to is that we have these ethical apps that we can still install. And so they had waking up to recognize you're the whole phone and ethical apps, but they didn't necessarily upgrade the operating systems. So there's just a few distinctions there to make it clear what it is.
If you still don't understand, we're going to tell you in binary. So, Chris, do we have access to our other communities? Okay, we're teleporting them in. Someone is calling me from another community. Okay, so in the meantime, do we have other questions? If we have a question here, Glenn.
When you look at other societies, in particular the American Indian Society, if American Indians didn't have slaves, women were equal, they had
I'm sorry, I hate to interrupt. About 15% of tribes had slaves. And moreover, tribes were related originally by kinship. And so there was a certain limit to how far that could go. The average tribe also had an ecological carrying capacity of about 40 people. Upwards of 2 out of 3 infants were thrown away because the carrying capacity wouldn't work. When the Native Americans first came to America, they made extinct several thousand species. They often practiced slash and burn. So I'm not being negative about that. I'm just describing the fundamental original states, because those are the ones that kept growing and growing and growing. But we have to be a little bit careful about idealizing any of the earlier stages. Many people mythologize the mythic medieval ages because there still seemed to be a unity in society. But it was a unity of fusion. So, for example, art and morals and science were all determined by the church. Therefore, there was no need for the church fathers to look through Galileo's telescope. They knew what they would see. The Bible told them so. And so there was no progress in science. There was no progress in art. There was no progress in morals. Starting in the Renaissance, they differentiated, what Wilber called the differentiation of the value theories. And that meant that science could go its own way, art could go its own way, and morals would go their own way. And when that happened, we had the explosion of the Western Enlightenment.
But if you
And so, go ahead.
If you read the Gospel of Redman, there's a feedback loop.
Leo, can you turn off the audio coming
Uh,
from there
no.
while he's talking?
If you read historical books like the Gospel of Redman, Ernest Thompson Seton, 36, it's much different. It does say that women were equal and that there was no slavery. The question is, when that society had a technological interaction with Western society, in particular around guns, the society lost and is wiped out, and there's very little left at this point. So as we evolve and communicate with technology, do you see any dangers associated with the integration of diverse ways of approaching what should be the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And what you're talking about is a real problem. And that is that even though we have these general stages of development that humans go through, such as archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, integral, even if a society is at, say, pluralistic, which the postmodern world is, pluralistic means multicultural beliefs. No one society has the truth. All cultures have their own truths. And that's what we call multiculturalism. We don't believe that any of them are superior. This is very different than how the modern scientific world looked at the planet. But even though we have a culture that's at pluralistic, everybody's born at square one. So an individual in the first year of life is at the archaic stages. From ages 1 to 3, roughly magic. Then from 3 to 5, a transition into mythic stages, which is around 5 to 7. And that extends on into the beginning of adolescence. At adolescence, the possibility of rationality occurs. Now, historically, rationality really didn't occur until about 300 years ago. So it's a very recent development. We had forerunners of it in Greece, but 1 out of 3 people in Greece were slaves. So it's a very mixed bag. It's sort of making some progress here and not there. And the concern with technology, well, I'll just take it back one era. The modern era, whose technology produced things like the atomic bomb. It also produced things like gas chambers. Now, a tribal society did not have the technology to produce Auschwitz. It wouldn't happen. That doesn't mean that they were operating from post-conventional levels of morality. Those hadn't even emerged. But it does mean their limited technology could do only so much damage. By the time we get to modernity, our technology can do devastating damage. Somebody who's at a modern level of morality would never make Auschwitz, ever. The modern level of morality is a world-centric, treat all people fairly. They would never have engaged in something like Auschwitz, a genocidal action. The mentality that produced Auschwitz was magic and mythic. And the Nazis had a myth of blood and soil and a supreme race. In other words, they're ethnocentric, they're racist. And that's the problem. We had higher levels of cognition and technology being commandeered by much lower levels of ethnocentric and even egocentric drives. That can happen in every ongoing era of our growth and development. So the modern world has at least 5 stages of growth that an individual has to go through in order to be mature. They have to go from archaic to magic to mythic to rational, pluralistic, and then we think of them as mature individuals. But every one of those stages can go wrong. Every one of them can be pathological. In tribal times, you had one transformation. You had to move from magic to mythic. That was it. There was one way to get sick, and that was to screw that transformation up. And if you did, you ended up being lost in the mythic world of alien beings, elemental spirits, gods and goddesses, and so on. So, a modern individual with 6 levels of growth has 6 ways of getting sick compared to a tribal individual. Modern humans can be sick in ways that tribal humans couldn't even imagine, because there was none of those upper developments that have occurred. The same thing can happen with technology. That's the scary part about it. Technology can go either way. And so it's up to us to try and get technology, for lack of a better word, on the side of the good guys. And that's one of the reasons we want to put growing up and waking up, despite the fact there are rare occasions and glimmers of those going together earlier stages. We want to make sure that that happens on a large scale. That'll give a bigger chance that the good guys have the technology? What good is it if the Nazis have the technology? It's possible. Now the European Union breaking up, and all the right-wing organizations that are all ethnocentric, by the way, they all believe their mission is the one and only. They don't want any higher world-centric unions. They don't want to be part of humanity. They want to be just French, or just German, or just British. That's Middle Ages. That's a disaster in a certain sense. So that's what makes this also terribly tricky. But one thing is sure, if we're unaware of all of these different parameters of waking up and growing up and cleaning up and showing up, then we're not going to know that we have to keep an eye on those. And they'll just happen of their own. And under those circumstances, something like Auschwitz is not that far away, ever. That's the scary part. Every stage can go wrong. So this is not a sweetness and lightness story. It's a, oh my God, story. But we have to keep all of these factors of human consciousness on the table and do the best we can to make sure each one of them is functional and relatively healthy and relatively good. Because it's not intrinsic in any of them.
Thank you, Ken.
It's a very good point, sir.
Yeah. So we're about 10 minutes over. Also, where we've got about probably close to 400 people now between live and our live streaming. So we've got a pretty good crowd here. So I'm sensitive to the time, and I'm also sensitive that I want to try to get 2 more questions in. One question from our audience tuning in from Crowdcast, and one question from Philly, who's over here on the screen. So Ken, we're going to treat these more as like summary answers, kind of just summarizing and kind of wrapping things up, so we can try to get through the last couple of questions and be faithful to our original schedule as much as possible. And so let's start with Philly over here. Hello, Philly. What's happening? Do we have any questions from Philly? We don't have to. No pressure. You can just wave hello also. Oh, well, hello, Philly. And then Cambridge is also tuned in, but Cambridge preferred to remain non-video. So we're going to do one question from our Crowdcast audience. The question is,
Okay.
and the phone turned off. I can't turn it back on. But the question is something like, how could we actually measure very advanced stages of state development, enlightenment specifically? And do you imagine that there will be something like an Apple Watch with a Bodhisattva detector on the Apple Watch? I think that was how the question was phrased.
Well, the wild thing about states is that almost all of the great meditative traditions, and that's not to say that we have to go the same way the meditative traditions have, but these are traditions that have been training people to move through these major stages of consciousness, growth stages, the subtle stages, the causal stages, to mirror mind, witnessing, mindfulness stages, the pure unity consciousness. These meditative systems around the world have been doing that for at least 2,000 years. You learn a lot at that time, but they've also learned that you can pass this knowledge on. These interior states are not just private, absolutely never knowable states. You can communicate them, and more importantly, you can train them. And a trained state is a public state. So it's much like judo. I can't say what judo is. If I just describe it, that's not going to teach you judo. You have to do judo. But you can do it, it can be taught, it's public knowledge. It's the same with meditative states. These aren't hidden, secret, locked up awarenesses. They can be trained, they're public, and they can be passed on. Many of them have been passed on for 2,000 years. So, we at least want to check in with the traditions, I think, first, to see what they have to tell us. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. We don't want to have to do all that over. We want to have to learn the positives and negatives about these stages of state development and so on. But, so once we do that, it's still fairly true that many of these states can be engaged fairly quickly. And so that is an important point. And so, at least to some degree, I don't think you can explore the fullness of a state in just 15 minutes. I'm plugged into it. 30 minutes later, I know it all. People spend years exploring the nuances of these deep, deep states of consciousness. So I think some of the introductory, slightly more superficial aspects of these states, I think those can be called forth fairly quickly. And if you want those on a watch, if you want, we've got some of them on our iPods. We've got, I mentioned earlier on, some of the more sophisticated ones that use EEG feedback and mind mirror and mind wave and MyPeace work and so on. There are ways to get into some fairly deep understandings of these. And I think simple ones can be put into things like Apple Watch, for example. We have very simple meditative states and things like Buddhify, where you just sort of select, hit 15 minutes, and it kind of talks you into a alpha relaxed state and so on. And those are all fine. But the real key is the deepest of the deep of these states. I mean, deep states of mindfulness turn into enlightenment. That's what it was created for. Mindfulness wasn't created to lower blood pressure, help us multi-track, reduce stress in a modern world, increase cognitive scores, help with learning. It happens to do all that, but that's not what it was invented for. It was invented as a way to find God. It was invented as a way to discover nirvana. That's what it's about. And so we want people plugging in to the deepest aspects of these states. And in order to do that, it might be that we want to learn specific orders of ever deeper states. Most of the maps of state meditation around the world go in stages. Daniel P. Brown, I think, is one of the most brilliant to have mapped out 5 major stages that most meditative systems go through. Dustin Hoffman is being transmitted in that at some point. He has books on streams of wisdom, Evolution's Alley. They go into structures and states of consciousness. I highly recommend Dustin's work. But the idea is to really plumb these so that we actually get the depth of these states of consciousness. That's where the real secrets start to come forth. So I think skip several steps down the line. When we really understand ways to help people move into the very deepest aspects of states, and then learn to be able to call up these state realizations, at that point, something like the 10th version of the Apple Watch might be able to include some things like that. What I am convinced of is that technology across the board will be able to help with all of these. That's the exciting point that we're all talking about right now. But it does depend on us having a fairly decent understanding of the various states of consciousness, the traditional stages they follow when they unfold, and then structures of consciousness and how these relate. Those are the central theoretical issues that we have to understand before we can help translate that into technology, and technology will teach us how to do it better. So, it's optimistic, but we've got an exciting amount of work to do.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you. This has been such